Dakota Territory, June 1886. While neighbors raced to finish log cabins before winter's teeth could bite, one Norwegian homesteader was just beginning something they'd never seen before. Lars Eriksson drove cedar pickets into prairie soil 12 inches beyond his freshly chinked walls, marking the perimeter of what would become the most mocked structure in the township. They called it a fence around a house. They called him wasteful. A perfectly good single-wall cabin with tight chinking was all any man needed on these plains, they insisted. Lars kept building anyway, measuring gaps with a carpenter's precision, while Thomas Harwick, the road overseer who'd survived 8 Dakota winters, stopped his weekly rounds to stare. The Norwegian was 38, lean, from 6 years hauling ice blocks in Bergen's waterfront warehouses, his hands scarred from saw teeth and splinters. He'd arrived in late May with 2 travel-worn trunks, a cross-cut saw that had belonged to his father, and ideas about walls that would earn him 3 months of ridicule before saving 11 lives. The mockery started the moment Lars began setting those outer pickets. Harwick 45 and weathered to leather by planes, wind spat tobacco juice into the dust, and asked what in creation the Norwegian was building now. Stormwall, Lars replied, checking his plumb bob against a picket, like they do for ice storage back in Bergen. Harwick's face twisted into something between amusement and contempt. That's a fence around a house, he said, waste of good lumber. Then he rode on, leaving Lars alone with his measuring tape and the certainty that winter would prove who understood these plains better. The actual cabin had gone up without incident through late June. 14 feet by 18 walls, 9 feet tall, logs notched and chinked with clay, mixed thick enough to seal gaps a knife blade couldn't penetrate. Lars worked methodically, selecting each log for straightness, rejecting any with excessive twist or deep checking. His neighbors nodded approval when they passed, satisfied he was building sensibly after all. A solid homestead cabin, tight enough to hold heat, sturdy enough to last decades if maintained properly. Then Lars started the framework that would transform approval into scorn. He cut ledger blocks from 2x4 stock, nailing them between pickets every 48 inches to hold his outer frame true and steady. At the base, he left a 3/4-inch gap for drainage and screened it with woven wire to contain whatever fill material he planned to pack into that 12-inch cavity. The precision bothered people. The time investment felt excessive. 4 days of careful measuring and cutting for a shell that served no obvious structural purpose seemed like madness to men who counted every hour against approaching winter. Martha Hayes rode past in early August, reining her mare to watch Lars run vertical planks up the outer frame. She was 32, the district's schoolteacher keeper of weather records for the territorial government, a woman who asked questions instead of offering opinions. Looks like a stockade for a house, she observed, but curiosity softened her tone rather than mockery. Lars paused, hammer in hand, and gestured toward the 12-inch gap between log wall and outer planking. Dead air, he explained. Moving air steals heat right through walls, pulls it out through every crack and gap. But air that can't move, air trapped in place, holds heat instead of carrying it away. He'd learned this principle not from books, but from 8 years in Bergen's ice warehouses, where they packed sawdust between inner and outer walls to keep winter ice frozen through July's heat. The same physics that preserved cold in summer could preserve heat in winter. Moving air meant thermal theft. Still air meant thermal protection. Martha asked how he knew this would work in a cabin. Lars told her about a conversation 2 weeks earlier at the general store with a Lakota woman who sold beautifully sewn buckskin goods to homesteaders' wives. The woman had described teepee liners' interior cloth walls hung 3 to 9 inches inside the outer hide, creating a buffer zone where air couldn't circulate freely. That trapped layer eliminated the drafts that made winter camps unbearable, she'd explained, keeping families warm even when winds screamed across open prairie. The liner wasn't insulation in the modern sense. It was a wind barrier that created dead air space, and dead air was the true insulator. Hearing that description, Lars had recognized the ice warehouse principle applied to portable shelter. Outer skin catches weather, inner wall holds living space, dead air between them provides protection. The Lakota had been using this method for generations, adapting it to nomadic life on plains where winter could kill the unprepared. Now Lars was adapting the same physics to permanent structure building, what amounted to a stationary teepee with log walls instead of hide. The outer skin went up in 1x10 rough-sawn boards that Lars had ordered special from the Jamestown mill. He ran them floor to eave, battening every seam with 1 by 3 strips, spaced 16 to 18 inches apart. At the roofline, he built a small overhang and flashed it with tin to shed snowmelt away from the cavity. Under the eaves, he left a half-inch vent slot to let moisture escape from whatever he planned to stuff between the walls. Every detail served a calculated purpose. Every measurement followed ice warehouse practice refined by observation of indigenous shelter design. Through late August and into September, while his neighbors finished harvest and began laying in firewood, Lars cut and dried prairie hay. He built drying racks from scrap lumber, spreading the cut grass thin so wind and sun could cure it properly. He spent days gathering moss from creek bottoms, where it grew thick in shade and dampness, spreading it on those same racks to dry until it crumbled at a touch. The hay he cut short and kept loose, understanding he needed material that would trap air without compacting into solid mass. He calculated roughly 120 cubic feet of fill for the cavity around his cabin walls, and he wanted every bit of it dry as paper and light as possible. Harwick visited again in mid-September, finding Lars knee-deep in dried hay filling burlap sacks for easier handling. "That'll rot by Christmas," Harwick predicted, gesturing at the golden piles. "Mice will nest in it, chew through to your logs, undermine everything you've built." Lars didn't look up from his work. "Ice houses use sawdust," he replied. "Stays dry if you vent it right. Mice avoid the dead air spaces because there's nothing to eat, no warmth to attract them." The explanation didn't convince Harwick, who rode away shaking his head at immigrant stubbornness. But Lars had seen sawdust insulation work for decades in Bergen, had helped maintain those warehouses, knew the principles were sound. The only real difference here was substituting hay and moss for sawdust, using what the prairie provided instead of mill waste. The physics remained identical: fibrous material, creating countless tiny air pockets that couldn't circulate, building thermal resistance through stillness rather than density. By early October, the mockery had settled into a steady pattern of community skepticism. Every man in the township had an opinion about the fence around Lars's house, and none of the opinions were favorable. They called it wasteful because he'd used 1,200 board feet of lumber for an outer skin that served no structural purpose. They called it foolish because everyone knew tight chinking and a hot fire were all any cabin needed to survive Dakota winter. They called it excessive because the gap between walls was wide enough to walk through, and who needed that much dead space around a perfectly good log house? But Lars kept working, filling that cavity, carefully tamping loose hay and moss to approximately 3 to 4 pounds per cubic foot, dense enough to stay in place, light enough to trap maximum air. At the top of each wall section, he tacked muslin as a wind check to prevent the fill from settling and creating cold spots where air could circulate. For doors and windows, he hinged the outer planks like shutters so they could swing open for access, but seal tight against weather. The work consumed 2 full months, 6 weeks longer than most men needed to finish a cabin completely. His neighbors watched him labor through September heat and into October cold, shaking their heads at the time and money he was throwing at a problem that didn't exist. When the first snow dusted the ground in mid-October and Lars was still adjusting his eave vents and door seals, they figured they'd have proof soon enough that one good wall was better than 2 poor ones. Winter would be the judge, and winter on these plains was a harsh courtroom where theoretical arguments died under practical reality. What they didn't understand was the physics Lars had learned from ice storage and adapted from Plains Indian wisdom. A blizzard wasn't just cold air sitting still. It was moving air under pressure, wind-driven cold, that infiltrated through every gap and crack, overwhelming whatever insulation a single wall might provide. That movement created convective heat loss that no amount of chinking could prevent. Air moving past a surface pulled heat away through contact, and the faster the air moved, the more heat it stole. But a sacrificial outer skin could take the wind's force while a dead air cavity broke its circulation. The outer planks would catch the mechanical energy of storm winds, creating turbulence in the 12-inch gap that dissipated velocity before air could reach the structural logs. Meanwhile, the hay and moss filling that cavity would trap whatever air made it through in thousands of tiny pockets, preventing the organized circulation that would otherwise pump heat away through convection. The logs themselves would sit in relatively calm air, protected from the thermal assault that was currently defeating every single wall cabin within 50 miles. The principles were sound-tested by decades of ice warehouse operation and centuries of indigenous shelter design. The materials were proven, The measurements were precise, and the construction was careful. By first snow, Lars's cabin was ready to demonstrate what his neighbors dismissed as the winter delusion of a stubborn immigrant who didn't know when to quit building. The first test came earlier than anyone expected, before calendars reached November, before anyone had stacked their full winter wood supply. October 15th brought 3 feet of powder snow in 18 hours, driven by winds that bent fence posts and stripped bark from cottonwoods along the creek bottoms. The storm arrived without the usual warning signs that old-timers relied on. No mare's tails in the western sky, no drop in barometric pressure that aged joints could feel before the first flake fell. One day the prairie lay brown and ready for winter. The next it disappeared under drifts that reached cabin eaves and buried wagon ruts completely. Horrick woke that first morning to find ice an inch thick in his water pail, sitting just 4 feet from his banked stove. The interior walls of his cabin wore a coating of frost where his breath had condensed and frozen during the night. He rekindled his fire with shaking hands, feeding it aggressively, watching flames struggle against drafts that seemed to come from every direction at once. Outside, wind howled at sustained speeds above 35 miles per hour, with gusts that rattled his door in its frame and sent puffs of snow through gaps he'd thought were sealed tight. By dawn, his thermometer read 22 degrees below zero outside, but inside his cabin felt barely warmer than freezing. He'd burned through his evening firewood allocation and half the next day's supply just trying to maintain enough heat to prevent his water from turning solid. The problem wasn't his stove or his wood quality. It was the wind driving cold air through every microscopic crack in his single-wall construction, while simultaneously sucking heated air out through other gaps on the leeward side. Martha Hayes faced identical physics at her cabin a mile south. She'd banked her fire carefully before bed, leaving a bed of coals that should have lasted until morning and made rekindling easy. Instead, she woke to a cold stove and interior temperatures that made her breath visible in cloudy puffs. Ice had formed on the inside surface of her logs, creating a crystalline coating that grew thicker as her body heat met the frozen wood. She wrapped herself in every quilt she owned and struggled to restart her fire with fingers so stiff she could barely strike a match. The mechanism destroying their comfort was invisible but relentless. Blizzard winds create pressure differentials that turn any structure into a giant bellows. Air gets forced through the tiniest gaps on the windward side, while heated interior air gets sucked out through openings on the lee. A single log wall, no matter how carefully chinked, presents hundreds of potential infiltration points where wind-driven cold can penetrate. The logs themselves become thermal bridges, conducting exterior cold directly to interior surfaces where it radiates into living spaces, stealing warmth faster than any stove can replace it. 3 miles northeast, Sarah McKenna was making her rounds between homesteads, checking on families with young children and elderly members who couldn't survive extended exposure to sub-freezing indoor temperatures. She was 38, a widow who'd lost her husband to pneumonia the previous winter, now serving as the township's unofficial medical aide because formal doctors were 3 days right away. At the Johansson place, she found the family huddled together in one corner, burning chair legs to supplement their dwindling firewood supply. The baby's lips had taken on a bluish tinge despite being wrapped in wool blankets and held close to her mother's body. At the Morrison cabin, old grandfather Morrison sat so close to the stove, his clothes nearly caught fire, yet his hands remained too cold to hold a coffee cup steadily. Each cabin told the same story of thermal defeat. Families were burning 1.5 to twice their normal evening wood allocation just to raise interior temperatures to 40 or 45 degrees by bedtime. Water pails froze solid overnight despite being placed near stoves. Moisture from cooking and breathing condensed on interior walls and froze into sheets of ice that made the logs themselves feel colder to the touch. The wind wasn't just lowering exterior temperatures, it was actively pumping heat out of supposedly sealed structures, creating convective losses that overwhelmed every defensive measure single-wall construction could offer. Families who'd survived previous winters with adequate preparation now faced conditions that threatened frostbite indoors, conditions that made simple survival a battle against physics they couldn't see or fully understand. Meanwhile, at Lars's double-walled cabin, different physics were playing out. The Norwegian had banked his fire the same way as his neighbors, with the same amount of wood and the same careful arrangement of coals. But his outer plank wall was taking the wind's full force, creating turbulence and pressure relief in the 12-inch cavity filled with loose hay and moss. The actual log structure sat in relatively still air, protected from the convective pumping that was defeating every other cabin in the township. The loose fibrous fill in Lars's wall cavity was performing exactly like the sawdust and tan bark used in commercial ice houses. Each strand of hay and clump of moss created tiny air pockets that couldn't circulate freely. Moving air steals heat through convection, transferring thermal energy away from warm surfaces through physical contact and movement. But trapped air held motionless by fibrous material becomes an insulating barrier because it can't carry heat away. The principle was so fundamental that ice house operators had relied on it for decades to preserve winter ice through summer heat, and now it was working in reverse to preserve winter heat through blizzard cold. Lars woke on the second morning to find his water pail still liquid, his interior walls free of frost. Most remarkably, his evening fire had lasted through the night with enough coals remaining to restart easily at dawn. He added kindling, carefully watching flames catch and grow without the desperate struggle Harwick was experiencing a quarter-mile away. The contrast wasn't luck or superior fire-building skill. It was applied physics, the difference between fighting infiltration and preventing it. By the third day of the storm, the temperature differential had become impossible to ignore. Harwick made the bitter trudge through knee-deep snow to check on his Norwegian neighbor, expecting to find Lars in the same desperate straits as everyone else. Instead, he found the immigrant calmly splitting kindling in his cabin, working in shirt sleeves while snow continued to pile against his outer walls. The sight stopped Harwick in the doorway, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew about Dakota winter. Lars's water pail showed no ice formation. His interior walls remained free of frost. The cabin felt warm enough that Harwick could actually sense heat radiating from the log surfaces instead of cold. Most remarkably, Lars's stove held a bed of red coals that clearly dated from the previous evening's banking, proving the fire had lasted through an entire night without additional feeding. Harwick's initial suspicion was some trick, a hidden stove or secret fuel source that explained the impossible warmth. The explanation was simpler and more profound. Dead air trapped between fibrous materials creates an insulating barrier that wine cannot penetrate. The outer wall absorbed the storm's mechanical energy, while the inner wall remained in a zone of thermal stability. This wasn't magic or Norwegian winter sorcery. It was applied physics that any icehouse foreman could have explained, adapted by a man who understood that the same principles preserving cold in summer could preserve heat in winter. Lars showed Harwick the smoke test. He lit his pipe, drew until the tobacco glowed, then blew a stream of smoke toward the outer plank wall. The smoke immediately bent horizontal and disappeared through invisible gaps between boards pulled by wind pressure and turbulence in the cavity. Then Lars repeated the test at the interior log surface, holding a small feather near the chinking. The feather barely stirred. Outer wall takes the wind, Lars explained quietly. Inner wall sits in still air. That stillness is what keeps heat from escaping. Harwick studied the construction with new eyes, seeing past his initial judgment to recognize the engineering at work. The 12-inch cavity wasn't wasted space. It was a buffer zone that absorbed wind energy before it could reach the structural wall. The loose hay and moss weren't going to rot or attract vermin. They were performing the same function as sawdust in an icehouse, creating countless tiny air pockets that prevented the organized circulation, which would otherwise pump heat away through convection. The storm raged for 7 more days, and with each dawn, the difference became more pronounced. Single-wall cabins were losing the battle against infiltration, their occupants burning through wood supplies at unsustainable rates, while still waking to frozen water and indoor temperatures barely above zero. Lars's double shell was winning through superior engineering, disguised as excessive construction, maintaining comfort with fuel consumption, that made Harwick question everything he thought he knew about frontier building. On the 4th morning, Lars began keeping a ledger. He'd noticed Martha's careful record-keeping during her visits to measure school children's progress, understood that numbers would carry more weight than claims when his neighbors finally asked how his cabin stayed warm. Each dawn at 6 o'clock, he recorded paired temperature readings using a mercury thermometer he'd purchased from the Jamestown hardware store before first snow. One measurement at the outer sill where his plank wall met the ground, exposed to the cavity's interior conditions. Another at the interior log surface 3 feet from his stove, representing the actual living space temperature gradient. The results were consistent and dramatic. October 19th, with his stove banked to coals since midnight, outer sill registered 14 degrees below zero, while the interior log wall read 7 degrees above, a 21-degree difference created by 12 inches of dead air and fibrous fill. October 20th showed similar results, 6 below at the outer measurement point, 15 above at the inner logs. Day after day, the temperature differential held between 17 and 23 degrees, with the best single reading reaching that 21-degree protection level. Lars recorded each measurement in careful script, building a data set that would survive skepticism because numbers didn't lie, and mercury thermometers didn't have opinions about Norwegian building methods. Harwick arrived on the 7th day desperate enough to ask direct questions. His own cabin required constant feeding to maintain any heat at all. His family was burning through wood supplies they'd expected to last until January, and the cold was beginning to threaten actual harm rather than just discomfort. He found Lars writing figures in a small leather notebook, carefully documenting what seemed impossible to men who'd survived 8 Dakota winters without ever seeing anything like this thermal stability. "How's your fire lasting all night?" Harwick demanded, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been the beginning of fear. Every cabin in the township required feeding every 3 to 4 hours to prevent complete heat loss, required constant vigilance that left families exhausted and still cold. Lars set down his pencil and reached for his pipe, already understanding that demonstration would convince where explanation had failed. He showed Harwick the smoke test first, explaining as he lit the tobacco. "Watch the outer wall," he said, then blew a stream of smoke toward the planking. The smoke bent horizontal, immediately pulled through gaps by wind pressure and turbulence in the cavity. Harwick could actually see the infiltration happening, see wind stealing heat through gaps that would exist in any wall exposed to these conditions. "Now watch this," Lars said, and repeated the test at the interior log surface. He held a small feather near the chinking where Harwick had personally watched him seal gaps months ago. The feather hung motionless, moved only by their breathing and the ambient air currents from the stove. No drafts, no convective pumping, no organized air movement that could carry heat away from the living space. "Outer wall takes the wind," Lars explained. "Creates turbulence, breaks up organized flow. Inner wall sits in still air, protected by that buffer zone. The stillness is what keeps heat from escaping." The physics were becoming clear through demonstration rather than theory. The 12-inch cavity, filled with loose hay and moss, was creating what icehouse operators called a cold buffer in summer, except now it was creating a warm buffer in winter, a sacrificial zone that absorbed the storm's energy before it could reach the structural wall. Commercial ice houses use the same principle with sawdust or tan bark packed between inner and outer partitions. The fibrous fill trapped air in countless tiny pockets, preventing the circulation that would otherwise pump thermal energy away through convection. Harwick studied Lars's fuel consumption records with growing disbelief. The Norwegian's evening wood bundle, measured by the armload and stacked for counting, was 35 to 45% smaller than what Harwick needed to achieve the same interior temperature target. Both men aimed for 52 to 55 degrees by 8 each evening, a reasonable goal for frontier comfort that allowed sleep without constant shivering. But where Harwick burned 6 to 8 split logs reaching that temperature, Lars needed only 4 or 5 pieces of similar size. The difference lay in heat retention rather than heat generation. Harwick's single-wall cabin was fighting constant infiltration, cold air streaming through microscopic gaps, while warm air escaped through others, creating a continuous thermal drain that made efficient heating impossible. His stove worked against losses it could never overcome, burning wood to heat air that immediately fled through cracks he couldn't find or seal. Lars' double wall had eliminated that drain by creating a dead air barrier that wind could not penetrate, allowing his stove to heat a space that actually held warmth instead of bleeding it away. Martha arrived on the 8th day to document the phenomenon herself. As district school teacher, she kept weather records for the territorial government, understood the value of systematic measurement, and the importance of documentation that could withstand official scrutiny. She brought her own thermometer, a matched instrument from the same Jamestown hardware batch, and spent an hour taking readings at various points around both cabins to eliminate any possibility of instrument error or measurement bias. At Harwick's place, she recorded interior lows of -5 to +5 degrees just before dawn, with ice forming in water pails throughout the night, despite proximity to the stove. Frost-coated interior walls so thickly she could scrape it with a fingernail creating a crystalline surface that made the logs themselves feel cold to touch. At Lars's cabin, she found steady readings between +10 and +14 degrees at the same pre-dawn hour, with no ice formation anywhere inside, and interior walls that felt neutral rather than cold. The mechanism deepened under scrutiny rather than falling apart. Modern understanding of insulation centers on trapped air, the principle that motionless air creates thermal resistance while moving air destroys it. Straw bale construction, developed decades later, would demonstrate R values of 1.2 to 4 per inch by using dense straw to trap air in fibrous matrices. Lars's loose hay and moss, while less dense than compressed straw bales, operated on identical physics. Each strand created microscopic air pockets that couldn't circulate freely, building thermal resistance through stillness rather than density. The comparison to teepee liners became more relevant as the storm continued. Plains tribes had used inner cloth walls for generations, creating a 3 to 9-inch gap that trapped calm air and controlled drafts. The principle was identical: in outer skin to catch weather, an inner wall for living and dead air between them for thermal protection. The Lakota woman who'd explained liner construction to Lars at the general store had unknowingly described the same physics that made icehouse insulation work, adapted to portable shelter instead of permanent structure. By the 10th day, Lars's temperature differentials were averaging +18 to +20 degrees between outer and inner wall surfaces. His fuel savings remained consistent at roughly 40% less wood consumption for equivalent interior comfort. Most importantly, his cabin maintained livable conditions without the desperate measures his neighbors were adopting: burning furniture, sleeping fully clothed under multiple blankets, or abandoning outlying rooms to concentrate heat in single spaces. The storm finally broke on October 22nd, leaving the township buried under drifts that would take weeks to melt. But the thermal lessons were permanently recorded in Lars's ledger and in the memories of neighbors who had experienced the difference between fighting wind and deflecting it. The double wall had proven itself not through theory, but through measurable performance during the worst conditions Dakota Territory could deliver in mid-autumn, before the true killing cold of January arrived. When Harwick finally asked to see the construction details, Lars walked him through the method without commentary or self-congratulation. The 12-inch cavity, the loose fill at 3 to 4 pounds per cubic foot, the ventilation slots that prevented moisture buildup, the sacrificial outer skin that took weather damage while preserving the structural logs. Every element served a measurable function in creating thermal stability that single walls could not match. Harwick stood in that cavity, reaching out to touch both walls, simultaneously feeling with his hands what the thermometer had measured with mercury. "Dead air," he said quietly, testing the phrase. Lars nodded. "Dead air holds heat because it can't move. Live air steals heat because it can. Everything else is just construction details serving that basic truth." The killing week had ended, but its lessons would spread through the township as neighbors realized that excessive preparation had proven to be exactly sufficient preparation, and that principles borrowed from ice storage and Plains Indian wisdom could mean the difference between survival and surrender when winter decided to test what men had built against its fury. The second storm arrived on November 3rd with 40-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures that dropped to 38 degrees below zero. This time, the crisis was immediate and life-threatening. At the Morrison cabin, Grandfather Morrison's breathing became labored in air so cold it burned his lungs with each inhalation. The Johansson baby developed a rattling cough that worsened each night as interior temperatures fell below freezing, despite a fire that consumed their remaining chair legs and half their floorboards. Sarah McKenna made her rounds on the second day and found conditions that demanded immediate action. At 3 separate cabins, she discovered families burning their furniture to supplement exhausted wood supplies while water froze solid in containers placed directly beside red-hot stoves. The wind was driving infiltration so severe that heated air disappeared as fast as fires could produce it. Frostbite was beginning to threaten fingers and toes of children and elderly who couldn't generate enough body heat to compensate for the thermal drain. The Johansson cabin told the worst story. Sarah found the mother sitting in the corner farthest from the door, wrapped in every blanket the family owned, clutching her 8-month-old daughter, whose lips had progressed from bluish to dark purple. The father was splitting their kitchen table into firewood, his movements frantic and increasingly desperate. "We can't keep her warm enough." The words came out between hammer strikes. Nothing we do keeps her warm enough. Sarah checked the baby's extremities and found them cold despite the layers of wool. The infant's breathing came in shallow gasps, each exhale visible in the frigid air. This child needed warmth that no amount of furniture burning could provide in a single-wall cabin fighting 40-mile-per-hour winds. Sarah made a decision that went against homestead pride and territorial stubbornness. You need to take her to the Norwegians' place, the double-wall cabin. It's the only structure in the township maintaining temperatures above freezing. The father's face hardened with something beyond cold. I'm not begging charity from a man we called wasteful. Sarah's voice cut through his pride like the wind cut through his walls. Then watch your daughter die to preserve your dignity. Those are your choices right now. At the Morrison place, Sarah found conditions equally dire. Grandfather Morrison sat wrapped in quilts so close to the stove that smoke damage had darkened the fabric, yet his core temperature registered dangerously low when she checked his pulse. His breathing came in ragged pulls, each inhalation clearly painful. The family had resorted to burning fence posts, dragging them inside one at a time, splitting them with axes in the living space because outdoor work was no longer survivable. Martha Hayes appeared at Sarah's side as the medical aide was leaving the Morrison cabin. The teacher's face showed exhaustion that went beyond physical cold. 3 more families in similar condition on the south section. We're going to lose people if this storm doesn't break. Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already done the mathematics of survival and found the equation wanting. The 2 women stood in wind that threatened to knock them down snow, driving horizontal across their field of vision. Martha had to shout to be heard. The Norwegian's cabin is the only one maintaining survivable conditions. I've documented it. 18 to 22 degrees warmer than any single wall structure. But people won't ask him for help because they mocked him for 3 months. Pride kills slower than cold, Sarah replied, but it kills just as dead. Then she turned into the wind and began the brutal walk toward Lars Eriksson's homestead. Lars opened his outer shutters to find Sarah McKenna standing in snow up to her knees, her face red from wind exposure, ice crystals forming in her eyebrows. We need shelter for families. People are going to die tonight if conditions don't improve. His response was immediate and without hesitation. Bring them. Bring everyone who needs warmth. We'll make room. The first family arrived within the hour. Harwick came with his wife and 2 sons dragging a sled loaded with blankets and cooking pots. His face showed the cost of that journey, the admission of error carved into every line. My boys were shivering so hard they couldn't sleep. His voice cracked on the last word. I was wrong about your walls. I was wrong about everything. Lars pulled the family inside through the vestibule he'd built around his outer door, a modification made after the first storm that created an airlock effect reducing infiltration by another 10 to 15%. He demonstrated the improvement by holding burning pipe tobacco near the floor at the inner door threshold. The smoke deflected less than 1/8 of an inch instead of the 1/4 inch movement they'd seen before the baffles went up. The Morrison family came next, 3 adults struggling to carry Grandfather Morrison through drifts that had buried the established paths between homesteads. The old man's breathing had deteriorated further during the transport, each inhalation a visible effort. They laid him near the stove, piling blankets over his frame, watching color slowly return to his face as the cabin's steady warmth began penetrating layers of hypothermia. The Johansons arrived last. The father carried their baby while the mother dragged a sack of possessions, her movements mechanical with exhaustion and fear. Lars took the infant, immediately feeling the dangerous coldness of her skin through the blankets. He positioned her mother near the stove, created a space where body heat and ambient warmth could work together to raise the child's core temperature back towards survivable levels. 11 people crowded into the 14 by 18-foot cabin, but the double wall system proved capable of handling the increased load. Lars had already added extra muslin baffles at the vestibule, creating layers of airlocks that reduced infiltration with each door opening. The modification worked through staging. Outer door opened to vestibule closed before inner door opened to living space, ensuring wind never had a direct path to the heated interior. The refugee families experienced thermal stability they hadn't felt in weeks. Water containers remained liquid throughout the night, despite being placed away from the stove to make room for people. Children stopped shivering and could remove their outer coats indoors without immediately freezing. Grandfather Morrison's labored breathing eased as he no longer had to work against the frigid air that stressed his aged lungs with every breath. Most remarkably, the combined evening fuel burn for all 11 people was 30% less per person than what the individual families had been consuming in their failed single-wall cabins. The efficiency came from heating stable air rather than constantly replacing air that fled through infiltration gaps. Every log added to the fire contributed to actual warmth instead of fighting a losing battle against convective losses. Lars spent the third day teaching emergency retrofits to neighbors who still clung to their own claims and refusing to abandon homesteads even temporarily. The technique was simple but effective. Lash-staked plank screens, 8 to 12 inches off the windward walls, stuffed the gap with loose straw from barn reserves, then lined the interior walls with blankets or muslin to limit drafts. Harwick implemented the emergency method first, using rough boards and baling wire to create a sacrificial windscreen along his cabin's north and west faces. He packed the gap with straw from his livestock feed material he'd been rationing for the animals, but now recognized had greater value protecting human life. Then he hung wool blankets inside to create an additional air barrier between the log surface and living space. The materials were crude compared to Lars's planned construction, but the physics remained sound. Create a buffer zone, trap air in fibrous material, prevent organized circulation that would pump heat away through convection. Within 48 hours, Harwick's pre-dawn interior temperatures had risen 12 to 16 degrees compared to the previous week's readings. Not as effective as Lars's full double shell, but survivable. Good enough to keep his family alive until the storm broke and proper construction could begin. The Morrison family followed the same approach on their cabin, focusing retrofit efforts on the bedroom where Grandfather Morrison would sleep once they could return home. They used canvas wagon covers instead of planks for the outer screen material that flexed in the wind, but still created the crucial buffer zone. The gap got filled with hay salvaged from their summer cutting, packed just dense enough to trap air without compacting into solid mass. The improvement was immediate and measurable. Martha brought her thermometer to document the changes, recording temperature gains of 14 degrees at the sleeping area, where the old man would spend most of his time. Frost stopped forming on the interior log surfaces in that room, and the air quality improved noticeably when breathing wasn't constantly condensing and freezing on exposed wood. The Johansson baby recovered within 5 days of moving into Lars's cabin, where steady interior warmth allowed her small body to fight off the respiratory infection that had developed in constantly cold air. Sarah McKenna noted in her medical records that the child's improvement coincided directly with exposure to consistent temperatures above freezing, something that had been impossible to maintain in the family's single-wall homestead during storm conditions. By November 10th, the immediate crisis had passed, but the lessons were permanently embedded in community memory. Families who had experienced thermal stability behind double walls could no longer ignore the fundamental inadequacy of single-wall construction in high-wind environments. The emergency retrofits had proven that the principle worked even with crude materials and hasty installation, that the physics were forgiving enough to accommodate frontier improvisation. Lars's vestibule modification became a standard recommendation for anyone attempting the double wall method. The airlock effect reduced infiltration at the most vulnerable point, the door threshold where human traffic created unavoidable gaps. Smoke tests showed that proper vestibule baffles could eliminate most floor-level drafts that otherwise undermined interior heating efforts, creating cold spots where children played and elderly sat. The social dynamics of the township shifted during those crowded days in Lars's cabin. Men who had mocked the fence around a house found themselves asking detailed questions about gap width, fill materials, and ventilation requirements. Lars answered without criticism or self-vindication, sharing measurements and techniques as practical information rather than personal triumph. The numbers spoke for themselves: 18 to 20 degree protection, 40% fuel savings, 0 frozen water containers indoors during the worst storm Dakota had delivered in living memory. When families finally returned to their own homesteads, they carried firsthand knowledge of what thermal stability felt like. Not the theoretical warmth of better construction, but the lived experience of sleeping without constant shivering of water that stayed liquid overnight, of air that didn't burn lungs with every breath. That knowledge would drive construction decisions for the next decade across 3 territories. The emergency retrofits remained in place through the rest of winter, providing measurable comfort improvements and fuel savings that validated the double wall principle under real-world conditions. What had begun as one man's excessive construction had become a community survival strategy, proven not through argument, but through the simple fact that people stayed warm when wind tried to freeze them. Martha spent late November documenting everything. Her records filled notebook after notebook with temperature differentials, fuel consumption rates, construction specifications, and most importantly, the human outcomes. Grandfather Morrison lived. The Johansson baby recovered. Three other families with vulnerable members survived conditions that would have killed them in conventional single-wall shelters. The data was irrefutable, the cause and effect so clear that even territorial officials 200 miles away would have to acknowledge the significance. December brought a brief warming period, temperatures climbing into the 20s, wind dropping to manageable speeds. Families used the respite to improve their emergency retrofits, replacing hastily lashed boards with properly measured framing, upgrading straw packing with better materials where available. Harwick ordered sawdust from the Jamestown mill, willing to pay freight costs for material that would last longer than hay and resist moisture damage more effectively. The blacksmith who serviced stoves throughout the township noted practical differences at cabins with double walls. He found fewer smoke back problems and steadier draws because the inner walls sat in calm air rather than fighting constant pressure differentials. His repair visits dropped significantly at double-walled structures, and he began recommending masonry sleeves for stovepipes and better door seals to homesteaders attempting their own versions of Lars's method. Construction details spread through informal networks rather than formal instruction. Neighbors observed each other's building techniques during barn visits and supply runs to Jamestown, noting gap widths, fill materials, and ventilation strategies that seemed to work better than others. The Morrison family opted for a 16-inch cavity filled with a mixture of sawdust and moss, reasoning that wider spacing would provide better insulation despite higher material costs. Martha chose 12 inches for her eventual retrofit planning to use all sawdust following icehouse practice more closely than Lars's original hay and moss combination. She'd researched the method at the Territorial Library during a trip to Bismarck, finding technical papers on cold storage that confirmed everything Lars had demonstrated through practical application. The physics were established science, not frontier experimentation. Lars had simply adapted proven principles to residential construction where they'd never been systematically applied before. January brought the true test cold that made November's storm seem mild by comparison. Temperatures stayed below zero for 18 consecutive days, with nighttime lows reaching -43 on January 9th. Wind maintained steady pressure above 25 miles per hour, creating conditions where exposed skin could freeze in under 3 minutes. This was the winter Dakota Territory used to separate survivors from the unprepared, the season that killed even experienced homesteaders who made single mistakes in judgment or preparation. The emergency retrofits held through that brutal stretch. Families with even crude double walls maintained interior temperatures that allowed normal life to continue. Children could do schoolwork without fingers going numb. Adults could perform indoor tasks without wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Sleep became restorative rather than a shivering endurance test. The difference wasn't luxury or comfort in the modern sense, but basic habitability that made survival sustainable rather than a daily crisis. Lars's cabin maintained its superior performance throughout January's worst cold. His temperature differentials stayed consistent at 18 to 22 degrees between outer and inner wall surfaces, even during the deepest cold snaps. The fuel consumption advantage held steady at 35 to 40% less wood for equivalent interior warmth compared to even the improved single-wall cabins. Most telling, his living space stayed above freezing every single night, while other cabins, even with retrofits, dipped below zero during the coldest hours. Sarah McKenna kept medical records that showed the health impact of that thermal stability. Respiratory infections dropped dramatically in families living behind double walls compared to previous winter rates. Elderly members maintained better overall health, their bodies not constantly stressed by fighting hypothermic conditions. Children grew normally instead of burning calories just to stay warm, their development proceeding as it should rather than being stunted by chronic cold exposure. The Johansson baby thrived through her second winter month, showing none of the respiratory distress that had nearly killed her in November. Her parents documented her weight gain, her increasing activity, her normal infant development that stood in stark contrast to her earlier crisis. They credited Lars's cabin with saving her life, but more accurately, They'd been saved by physics that didn't care about national origin or community opinion, only about whether air could move or not. February brought the first serious discussions about permanent construction changes. The emergency retrofits had worked well enough to keep people alive, but they were clearly temporary solutions, crude implementations of a principle that deserved better execution. Homesteaders began planning spring building projects, calculating lumber requirements and material costs, debating cavity widths and fill materials with the seriousness of people who'd learned that construction decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Harwick organized a community meeting at the general store in mid-February, the first time the township had gathered for non-emergency purposes since October. 47 people crowded into a space meant for 20, but no one complained about the proximity. Harwick stood near the potbelly stove and spoke words that 3 months earlier would have been impossible for him to imagine saying. Lars Eriksson saved lives this winter. His construction method, the one we called wasteful and foolish, kept 11 people alive during conditions that would have killed them in conventional cabins. I've documented fuel savings averaging 38% across 6 families using emergency retrofits. I've measured temperature differentials of 12 to 22 degrees, depending on construction quality. The numbers don't lie, and neither does the fact that we're all standing here alive to have this conversation. Martha presented her formal documentation, spreading notebooks across the counter, showing temperature records, fuel consumption logs, health outcomes, and construction specifications. The data was overwhelming in its clarity. Double wall construction worked. It worked in hastily assembled emergency form, and it worked even better in planned permanent installation. The principle was sound, the materials were available, and the cost in lumber and labor was justified by the results. A younger homesteader named James Peterson raised the question everyone was thinking. How much does it cost? For proper construction, not emergency boarding. Lars had prepared for this. He'd calculated material costs based on Jamestown prices, labor hours based on his own experience, and long-term maintenance based on winter performance. For a cabin the size of mine, 1,200 board feet for outer skin, 600 feet for framing, roughly 30 cubic yards of fill material, whether sawdust, hay, or combination. Figure $200 in materials if you're buying everything. Add 40 hours of labor if you're building alone, 20 if you have help. Maintenance runs maybe $20 a year for fill replacement and board repairs. Someone in the back called out the obvious objection. That's twice what a standard cabin costs. Lars didn't flinch, and it uses 40% less fuel every winter for the life of the structure. You'll recover the construction premium in wood savings within 5 years. Maybe 3 if wood prices keep rising. After that, it's pure savings every season. Plus, you don't freeze to death, which I consider a significant additional benefit. The room absorbed that mathematics in silence. Then Harwick spoke again, his voice carrying weight earned through 8 winters of experience. I've already ordered lumber for a complete retrofit. My family spent 3 weeks in Lars's cabin while our emergency boards barely kept our place survivable. I'm not gambling on minimum construction again. The extra cost is insurance, and given what we nearly lost, it's the cheapest insurance I'll ever buy. By the time the meeting ended, 7 families had committed to full double wall construction beginning in spring. 5 more planned emergency retrofit upgrades, improving their crude November work into permanent installations. 3 families requested permission to visit Lars's cabin for detailed study of the construction techniques, wanting to see the actual implementation before beginning their own projects. Lars walked home through February cold that felt almost mild after January's brutality. The wind had shifted, bringing temperatures up towards 0, making the 2-mile journey from the general store almost pleasant by Dakota standards. He thought about the meeting, about men who 3 months ago had called him wasteful, now asking for construction advice, about families who'd mocked his fence around a house, now calculating how quickly they could afford similar protection. The vindication should have felt satisfying, some part of him knew, but mostly he felt tired. Tired from the winter's intensity, from the nights of hosting 11 refugees in a space meant for 1 person, from the emotional weight of knowing that his construction method had become the difference between life and death for neighbors who'd initially refused to even consider the possibility that he might be right. His cabin appeared through the snow outer walls, already showing wear from wind abrasion, a few boards needing replacement come spring. but the structure had performed flawlessly, had done exactly what he'd designed it to do, protected the inner wall from direct weather. Assault created dead air space that trapped heat instead of bleeding it away, maintained thermal stability through the worst winter in local memory. Inside, the familiar warmth wrapped around him like a reward for months of careful planning and execution. The stove held its heat efficiently. The air quality was good, despite closed ventilation during the coldest weather, and the water pail showed no ice formation despite sitting overnight without fire feeding. This was what proper construction felt like, what physics allowed when principles were understood and properly applied. March arrived with the first genuine thaw temperatures climbing into the 40s during daylight hours, snow beginning its slow retreat from drifts that had reached roof lines. The township emerged from winter like survivors from a siege, counting losses and assessing damage, planning repairs and improvements, with the desperation of people who'd learned hard lessons about preparation. Spring came early in 1887, but by then the request for construction details had already begun in earnest. Harwick appeared at Lars's door in late March with a notebook and a measuring tape, asking for dimensions, spacing intervals, and a complete bill of materials. Not for himself alone, he explained, but for his brother-in-law, who was planning to homestead the following year and had heard stories about the Norwegian's cabin that survived what others couldn't. Lars provided the information without commentary, walking Harwick through every element of the construction. 12-inch cavity minimum, though wider, was acceptable if materials allowed. Cedar pickets at 36-inch spacing for the outer frame ledger blocks every 48 inches to maintain structural integrity. 1x10 planks for the outer skin with 1x3 battens covering the seams. Half-inch vent slots at the eaves to prevent moisture accumulation. Woven wire screening at the base gap to contain fill material while allowing drainage. The technical specifications filled 6 pages of Harwick's notebook, detailed enough that a competent builder could replicate the system without guesswork. Lars didn't charge for the information, didn't demand credit or recognition. The principles belonged to everyone, had been practiced in ice houses and indigenous shelters for generations before he had adapted them to homestead cabins. What he'd done was synthesis and application, not invention. The knowledge should spread freely to anyone willing to build properly. Martha made the second formal request, this time for inclusion in her annual report to the Territorial Education Office. She documented the thermal performance through 2 major storms and wanted to preserve the technical details for other frontier teachers who might face similar challenges in remote schoolhouses where maintaining winter warmth could mean the difference between functional education and seasonal closure. Lars walked her through the entire system with the same thorough detail he'd given Harwick. The woven wire screening that prevented fill material from settling into the base gap while still allowing moisture drainage. The muslin wind check above the loose fill that kept material from shifting and creating thermal weak spots. The tin flashing that shed meltwater away from the cavity instead of allowing it to penetrate and compromise the fill. The hinged outer shutters that provided storm protection for windows and doors, creating additional buffer zones during the worst weather. By summer, 3 of the 7 nearby homesteads had ordered lumber for permanent double-wall construction. The Morrison family committed first investing in a complete retrofit that would protect Grandfather Morrison through another winter. They chose a 14-inch cavity instead of 12, using sawdust from the Jamestown mill where hay was scarce. The wider gap allowed for denser packing while maintaining the dead air principle that made the system effective. The Johansson family opted for 16 inches filled with a mixture of sawdust and moss, reasoning that maximum width would provide best insulation despite material costs running nearly $250. For people who'd nearly lost their daughter to winter cold, the expense was trivial compared to the protection gained. They began construction in April, working through spring planting to complete the retrofit before next winter could threaten. Martha chose to retrofit her own cabin with 12-inch spacing, but all sawdust fill, following icehouse practice more closely than Lars's original hay and moss combination. She documented her construction process with the same detail she'd applied to winter temperature records, creating a reference guide that would eventually be published in territorial agricultural bulletins as a model for proper implementation. Results from the winter of 1887 to 88 validated the method across multiple implementations, proving it wasn't unique to Lars's specific construction, but a general principle that worked when properly applied, regardless of individual variations. Martha kept detailed fuel consumption records for all 3 double-wall cabins, documenting 25 to 40% reductions in evening wood requirements to reach 55-degree interior targets. More importantly, none of the retrofitted homes experienced frozen water containers indoors during storm periods. All maintain pre-dawn temperatures above 10 degrees. Throughout January's worst cold, snaps a dramatic improvement over the previous winter's performance in single-wall structures. The data confirmed what Lars had demonstrated. Double walls worked, the principle was sound, and the benefits justified the investment for anyone serious about long-term survival on the northern plains. The reputation of Lars's method spread beyond the immediate township through correspondence networks that connected frontier communities across 3 territories. County agents began including double-wall construction details in their agricultural bulletins, treating the technique as proven field practice rather than experimental innovation. The approach aligned with established ice house insulation methods, giving it technical credibility that helped overcome resistance to what some still dismissed as immigrant improvisation. By 1890, the double-wall principle had appeared in formal agricultural extension publications. A correspondent for the Dakota Farmer wrote detailed articles on dead air insulation, complete with diagrams showing proper cavity widths, fill densities, and ventilation requirements. The technique was described as particularly valuable in high-wind regions where standard chinking could not prevent infiltration during severe weather events. The articles cited Lars by name, crediting the Norwegian homesteader with adapting commercial cold storage principles to residential construction in ways that saved lives during the brutal winter of 1886 to 87. Martha received a letter from the Territorial Education Office in May of 1890 requesting permission to include her documentation in a manual for frontier teachers. The manual would provide guidance on maintaining schoolhouse warmth during winter months, with Lars's double-wall method featured as the recommended solution for new construction in exposed locations. She rode to Lars's cabin with the letter, finding him in his garden, where he was planting vegetables in soil finally warm enough to support growth. They want to publish everything, all my temperature, records your construction specifications, the fuel consumption data. It'll reach every school district in Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming territories. She watched his face for reaction, curious whether he'd embrace the recognition or retreat from it. Lars straightened from his planning, wiping soil from his hands. Will it help teachers keep their schoolhouses warm? That's all that matters. If someone in Montana reads those specifications and builds properly because of it, then publish whatever helps them succeed. The manual appeared in print that fall, distributed to 217 school districts across the Northern Territories. It included 16 pages on thermal management, with Lars's double-wall method occupying the central section, complete with measured drawings, material specifications, and winter performance data from Martha's meticulous records. Teachers in remote districts studied those pages like scripture, understanding that proper construction could mean the difference between maintaining winter classes or closing for months. Applications of the method began appearing in unexpected places. A missionary building a church in eastern Montana used double walls with a 20-inch cavity, creating a worship space that stayed above freezing during Sunday services without requiring continuous fire feeding. A doctor constructing a clinic near the Wyoming border adapted the principle to create temperature-stable conditions for patients recovering from cold-related injuries. A trading post operator on the northern edge of settlement used double walls to protect inventory from freeze damage that had previously cost him hundreds of dollars each winter. Each adaptation proved the universality of the underlying physics. Dead air trapped between fibrous materials created thermal barriers regardless of building size or specific application. The principle worked at church scale, in cabin scale, in commercial structures, and residential ones, wherever wind and cold threatened to overwhelm inadequate construction. Success bred imitation, and imitation spread the method far beyond Lars's original township into regions where his name was known only through technical documentation. But success also bred unexpected complications. In late summer of 1890, a timber company representative from Jamestown appeared at Lars's door with a business proposition. The man wore a suit too fine for frontier travel, his shoes already dust-covered from the ride out from town. He introduced himself as Clayton Morris, regional manager for Northern Plains Lumber, and asked if they could discuss a business opportunity. Lars invited him inside, offering coffee, curious what business a lumber company had with a homesteader. Clayton accepted the coffee and got directly to his purpose. We've seen orders for double wall construction increase 300% over the past 18 months. Homesteaders are requesting specific dimensions for outer framing, specific board widths for skin material. They're citing your construction method by name. We want to hire you as a consultant to help us develop pre-cut packages that make the method more accessible. The offer came with specifics: $200 per month to review designs, approve material specifications, and provide technical guidance for a standardized double wall system. The company would handle manufacturing and distribution, taking the concept from individual custom builds to mass production that could serve the entire Northern Territory market. Lars would receive recognition as the method's originator and a percentage of sales revenue from pre-cut packages sold using his specifications. Lars listened to the entire pitch before responding. The principles aren't mine to sell. Ice houses have used dead air insulation for decades. Plains tribes used the same concept in their shelters for generations before any of us arrived. I just combined existing knowledge in a new application. You don't need my permission to manufacture building materials based on established physics. Clayton leaned forward, his pitch shifting toward persuasion. But homesteaders trust your name. They've read the articles, seen the performance data. A package endorsed by Lars Eriksson would sell better than generic materials claiming similar benefits. Your reputation adds value we can't manufacture ourselves. The words settled heavy in the cabin's warmth. Lars understood what was actually being offered. Not just compensation for technical advice, but transformation of his identity from homesteader who'd solved a local problem into commercial spokesman for a building products company. The money was real, the recognition was genuine, but acceptance would change his relationship with every neighbor who'd learned the method freely, every teacher who'd used the specifications without charge, every homesteader who'd asked questions and received answers without expectation of payment. I need time to consider this. The response bought space to think, to weigh financial security against principles that had guided his actions since arriving in Dakota. Clayton left his card, a printed rectangle declaring his authority to negotiate on behalf of Northern Plains Lumber, and rode back toward Jamestown, carrying Lars's promise of an answer within 2 weeks. That evening, Lars walked to Harwick's homestead, needing perspective from someone who understood both the practical value of the construction method and the community dynamics that had made it controversial before proving essential. He found Harwick in his barn repairing harness leather by lantern light and laid out the lumber company's offer without embellishment. Harwick listened until Lars finished, then set aside his leatherworking tools. $200 a month is serious money. That's more than most homesteaders clear in a year. You'd be foolish to turn it down based on some notion that knowledge should be free. You developed something valuable. Taking payment for value isn't betrayal, but I didn't develop it. Lars's frustration came through despite his attempt at calm. I borrowed from ice houses and indigenous shelters. The physics are old, the materials are common, the measurements are basic carpentry. Attaching my name to a commercial product makes it seem like I invented something instead of just applying what others already knew. Harwick stood facing Lars directly. You saved 11 lives, including my son's. You shared the method freely when you could have kept it secret, used it as leverage for profit or influence. Now a company wants to compensate you for helping more people benefit from what you demonstrated. I don't see the conflict. Take the money, help them build good products, make sure homesteaders get proper materials instead of cheap imitations that fail when winter tests them. The argument had merit, Lars recognized. Quality control mattered. If the method was going to spread commercially, having someone with actual winter experience reviewing specifications could prevent dangerous shortcuts that would discredit the entire principle. But something in the offer still felt wrong. A transformation of community knowledge into proprietary product that would create divisions between those who could afford pre-cut packages and those who had to improvise with raw materials. He thanked Harwick and walked home through September twilight, no closer to a decision than before the conversation. The money would provide security his homestead never could, would allow improvements and investments impossible on subsistence income. But accepting would change how people saw him, would transform a neighbor who'd shared knowledge freely into a businessman, profiting from others' need for warmth. Martha visited 2 days later, having heard about the offer through the township's informal information network. She found Lars repairing his outer wall boards, replacing weather-damaged sections that had protected the structural logs through 4 winters. He explained the lumber company proposal, while working his hands busy with hammer and nails, even as his mind wrestled with competing principles. Martha watched him work in silence before offering her perspective. The manual I wrote it is helping teachers across 3 territories. Some of them are building properly because they have detailed specifications to follow. Others are building poorly because they were trying to save money using materials that won't last or cavity widths that won't provide adequate protection. If this company can deliver quality pre-cut packages at reasonable prices, more schoolhouses will have proper thermal protection. That seems like a good outcome. But they want to use my name as marketing, Lars countered. They want Lars Erickson approved packages, not just technically sound building materials. That feels like using trust I earned through sharing freely to drive commercial sales. Then make it conditional. Approve their designs without endorsing their company. Let them say the specifications meet your standards without claiming you're their spokesman. Take payment for technical consultation while refusing to become their advertising asset. There's middle ground between accepting everything they offer and rejecting all of it. The suggestion opened possibilities Lars hadn't considered. He could provide technical oversight without becoming commercial property, could ensure quality while maintaining distance from marketing that made him uncomfortable. The distinction mattered the difference between accepting compensation for expertise and selling his identity for profit. He sent his response to Clayton Morris 1 week later. He would review designs and approve specifications for $200 per month, but his name could only be used to certify technical accuracy, not to endorse the company or recommend their products over alternatives. Northern Plains Lumber could state that their double-wall packages met Lars Erickson's construction standards, but could not claim his personal recommendation or exclusive partnership. The limitations protected what mattered most: the community relationship built through shared knowledge, and the principle that life-saving information should remain accessible regardless of commercial interests. Clayton accepted the modified terms, understanding that Lars's technical approval carried value even without full marketing rights. The first pre-cut packages appeared in Jamestown lumberyards that winter, accompanied by specifications certified as meeting Erickson thermal performance standards. Sales exceeded expectations with homesteaders across the territories, recognizing the value of precisely measured materials that eliminated guesswork from what had been complex custom construction. The winter of 1890 to 91 brought validation of both the method's spread and its continued effectiveness. Reports reached Lars from homesteaders using company packages, from teachers using manual specifications, from missionaries and doctors and trading post operators who'd adapted the principle to their specific needs. Temperature differentials range from 15 to 25 degrees depending on construction quality and cavity width. Fuel savings averaged 30 to 45% compared to single-wall structures. Most importantly, no deaths were reported from hypothermia in properly constructed double-wall buildings, a stark contrast to previous winters when cold-related fatalities occurred regularly in conventional cabins. Grandfather Morrison died in March of 1891 at age 81, passing peacefully in his sleep rather than freezing during a winter storm. His family sent Lars a letter expressing gratitude for the 5 additional years the double-wall retrofit had provided, years that wouldn't have been possible without construction that kept an elderly man warm through Dakota's worst weather. The old man had lived to see 3 more grandchildren born, had passed on stories and skills that would have died with him in 1886 without Lars's intervention. The Johansson baby, no longer an infant, but a healthy 4-year-old, showed no lasting effects from her near-death November experience. Her parents documented her normal growth and development in letters to Sarah McKenna, crediting the medical aid's quick action in getting them to Lars's cabin during the crisis. But they also recognized that quick action alone wouldn't have saved their daughter without a structure capable of maintaining temperatures where small bodies could fight infection instead of dying from combined cold and illness. Martha's schoolhouse received a double-wall retrofit in summer of 1891, built by community volunteer labor using specifications from her own manual. The improvement transformed winter teaching conditions, allowing classes to continue through cold snaps that previously would have forced closure. Students could focus on lessons instead of fighting numbness in their fingers and toes. Educational outcomes improved measurably in winter months, attendance stayed consistent, and Martha's year-end reports showed achievement gains she attributed directly to better thermal conditions. By 1892, Lars's monthly consulting income had reached $250, as Northern Plains Lumber expanded their pre-cut package offerings to include variations for different building sizes and climate conditions. He used the money to improve his own homestead, adding a workshop where he could work on carpentry projects during winter months, upgrading his equipment and building proper storage for tools and materials that had previously been exposed to weather. But the most significant change came in how the community saw him. No longer the wasteful Norwegian who'd built a fence around his house, he'd become the man who'd adapted ice house principles to save lives and whose methods now protected thousands of families across the Northern Territories. The transformation from outsider to authority had happened so gradually that Lars barely noticed until the township decided to mark 5 years since the crisis winter with a formal recognition ceremony. They held it in December of 1891, gathering at the general store on a Saturday when most families could travel despite winter conditions. 47 people filled the space, the same number who'd attended Harwick's February meeting 5 years earlier, when the community had first acknowledged the double wall method's effectiveness. But the tone was different now, less desperate survival and more celebration of endurance, recognition that they'd collectively learned something valuable that winter and successfully applied those lessons across 5 subsequent years. Harwick, now serving his second term as township mayor, stood near the pot-belly stove and spoke words that carried weight earned through experience. 5 years ago this month, we nearly lost people we care about to winter cold that overwhelmed our conventional construction. Lars Eriksson's cabin kept 11 of us alive during conditions that would have killed some of us in single-wall structures. More importantly, he shared his method freely when he could have kept it secret, used it for leverage or profit. Because of that generosity, families across 3 territories now live safely in structures that can withstand the worst weather this region delivers. Martha presented documentation of the method's spread. Her records showed 237 confirmed double-wall structures built using Lars's specifications across Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming territories. Schoolhouses, churches, clinics, trading posts, and hundreds of residential cabins now employed the principle that Lars had demonstrated on this township 5 years earlier. The economic impact was measurable in reduced wood consumption, but the human impact was visible in lives saved and families who'd survived conditions that would have killed them in conventional construction. Then Martha produced something unexpected. A quilt hand-sewn by 15 women from the township and surrounding homesteads depicting Lars's cabin in careful detail. Each woman had embroidered her family name beneath the house, creating a visual record of who'd been saved by the construction method and who'd learned from its principles. The stitching was precise, the fabric chosen for durability, the whole piece constructed to last decades as a physical reminder of that crisis winter and its lessons. For someone who saved our families by understanding that still air holds heat, while moving air steals it, Martha's voice carried emotion she rarely showed. For someone who taught us that preparation others called excessive can prove exactly sufficient when conditions test what we built. For someone who shared knowledge freely instead of hoarding it for personal advantage. This quilt represents gratitude from families who owe their lives and their children's lives to what you demonstrated 5 years ago. Lars accepted the quilt without speech, his hands recognizing the hours of work represented in thousands of careful stitches, his eyes tracking the family names embroidered beneath his cabin's image. Morrison, Johansson, Harwick, Hayes, Peterson, names of people he'd sheltered, people he'd taught, people who'd built their own versions of thermal protection based on principles he'd freely shared. The weight of the fabric felt heavier than its physical mass, carrying the accumulated trust of a community that had transformed mockery into respect through brutal experience. When he finally spoke, his words came from deeper places than technical expertise or immigrant stubbornness. This winter taught me that the knowledge we share freely becomes more valuable than knowledge we guard for profit. Ice houses and teepee liners taught me the physics, but you taught me that understanding why something works matters less than making sure it works for everyone who needs it. If this method saves one child in Montana or one grandfather in Wyoming, then the mockery I endured building it was the smallest price anyone could pay for such return. The room held silence for a moment, absorbing words that carried truth beyond their simple construction. Then someone started clapping and the sound spread until everyone was applauding, not just Lars, but the principle he demonstrated, that knowledge shared multiplied its value while knowledge hoarded died with its keeper. The ceremony ended with coffee and conversation, families sharing stories of their own double wall experiences, comparing construction techniques, and discussing improvements for future builds. Lars stood at the edge of the gathering, the quilt folded carefully over his arm, listening to conversations about cavity widths and fill materials, about ventilation strategies and moisture management. These weren't theoretical discussions anymore. They were practical exchanges between people who'd all experienced the difference between adequate construction and inadequate, who'd all learned that winter was a ruthless teacher and the only passing grade was survival. Walking home that night through December cold that registered 12 below, but felt almost mild after 5 years of worse, Lars thought about the arc from mockery to recognition, from isolated immigrant to trusted authority. The transformation hadn't been sought, hadn't even been particularly wanted. He'd simply built according to principles he understood, shared those principles when asked, and let performance speak louder than argument. His cabin waited at the end of the dark walk, outer walls, now showing 5 years of weather exposure but still performing their crucial function. Sacrificial barrier, taking wind abuse while protecting structural logs, creating dead airspace that trapped heat instead of bleeding it away into Dakota's infinite cold. The physics remained unchanged from that first winter. Still reliable, still effective, still the difference between comfort and crisis when temperatures dropped and wind rose. Inside, the familiar warmth wrapped around him like reward for years of careful maintenance and principled sharing. The quilt would hang on his wall, a reminder that community trust was built through action rather than words, through demonstration rather than persuasion. 15 women had invested hours in that fabric, each stitch a vote of confidence in principles proven through winter's harshest testing. The winter of 1891 to 92 proved mild by Dakota standards, with fewer extreme cold snaps and less sustained high wind than previous years. But the double wall structures performed consistently, maintaining their thermal advantages even during moderate conditions. The method wasn't just crisis protection, Lars realized. It was everyday efficiency comfort that didn't require extreme weather to justify its value. By 1893, 60% of new cabin construction in the region incorporated double wall walls, making the method standard rather than exceptional. Lumber yards stocked pre-cut packages as regular inventory, eliminating the special order delays that had initially complicated access to proper materials. County agents stopped treating the technique as innovative adaptation and started listing it as recommended practice for any construction in high-wind regions. Martha received appointment as regional educational consultant in 1894, a position created specifically to help frontier schools improve their physical facilities and thermal management. Her first major project was developing standardized plans for one-room schoolhouses incorporating double-wall construction from the foundation up rather than as retrofit addition. The plans included Lars's specifications, credited by name, distributed across 7 territories as the territorial government expanded educational infrastructure into newly settled regions. Lars continued his consulting work with Northern Plains Lumber, approving new designs as the company developed variations for different building types and regional conditions. The monthly income had stabilized at $300, enough to make his homestead financially secure while allowing investment in community improvements. He funded construction of a community meeting hall with proper double-wall insulation, donated materials for schoolhouse retrofits in poorer districts, and quietly helped families who couldn't afford full construction costs but needed better thermal protection. The work felt right in ways that pure profit never could. Money earned from helping people build properly, spent on ensuring more people could build properly, creating a cycle that amplified the original knowledge sharing rather than hoarding value for private benefit. The lumber company prospered, Lars prospered, and more importantly, families across the territories lived more safely through winters that still killed the unprepared but no longer threatened those who built with understanding. In 1895, a young engineer from the Territorial Agricultural College visited Lars's homestead to study the construction method for inclusion in an engineering textbook. The engineer, barely 25 and full of formal education, arrived expecting to find primitive improvisation that would need theoretical refinement before publication. Instead, he found precisely measured construction implementing principles that matched the latest thermodynamics research from universities back east. You've essentially built a residential application of commercial cold storage insulation. The engineer's surprise was evident as he measured cavity dimensions and examined fill material distribution. The R value achieved through your fibrous air trap design matches what we're seeing in laboratory testing of similar materials. This isn't folk wisdom that happens to work. This is sound engineering that preceded the formal theory we're only now developing to explain why it works. Lars had heard similar observations before from visitors with technical education. The principles were old, the physics were fundamental, and the application was logical. Once someone made the connection between keeping cold in and keeping cold out. What surprised him was that academic institutions were only now catching up to what icehouse operators had known for generations and indigenous peoples had practiced for centuries. The textbook appeared in 1896, devoting an entire chapter to residential thermal management, with Lars's cabin featured as a case study and practical application of insulation theory. The engineering students who studied that chapter would go on to design buildings across the country, carrying principles learned from a Dakota homesteader into contexts Lars could never have imagined. Hotels in Denver, hospitals in Minneapolis, government buildings in Helena, all eventually incorporated variations on the dead air principle Lars had demonstrated through simple frontier construction. By 1897, Lars's original cabin had become something of a destination for people interested in building science. Engineers, architects, agricultural agents, and homesteaders all made the journey to see the structure that had sparked a regional construction revolution. Lars welcomed them all, walked them through the construction details, shared the performance data accumulated over 11 winters, and sent them away with information they could apply in their own contexts. The visits became frequent enough that Lars started keeping standard documentation ready for distribution. Measured drawings, material specifications, fill density calculations, ventilation requirements, all compiled into packets that visitors could take with them, rather than spending hours copying information by hand. The packets spread across the country, reaching places Lars would never visit, helping people he'd never meet, build structures that could withstand local climate challenges through understanding rather than just brute force. Martha's documentation found its way into the Library of Congress in 1898, archived as an example of citizen science and practical problem solving that advanced public knowledge. Her meticulous temperature records, fuel consumption logs, and construction specifications were now permanent federal record preserved for future generations who might wonder how frontier communities survived conditions that killed the unprepared. Grandfather Morrison's death became part of that archived record, a data point showing that proper construction extended lives measurably, that 5 additional years for an elderly man represented value beyond economic calculation. The Johansson baby, now a healthy 7-year-old beginning formal schooling in Martha's double-wall classroom, represented the other end of that value spectrum, a life saved in infancy, who would live on to contribute whatever future she chose to build. In winter of 1900, Lars stood in his cabin on the 14th anniversary of its completion. The structure had weathered 14 Dakota winters, had sheltered refugees during crisis, had served as model for thousands of subsequent builds, and had transformed frontier construction practice across 3 territories. The outer walls showed their age boards weathered gray and requiring periodic replacement, but the fundamental system remained sound, still creating dead air barriers that trapped heat, still maintaining thermal stability that single-wall construction could never match. He thought about the arc from mockery to monument, from waste to wisdom, from one stubborn immigrant to a building method that had saved uncounted lives and improved living conditions for tens of thousands of families. The journey hadn't been sought, hadn't been planned, had simply unfolded from doing what made sense based on knowledge borrowed from ice houses and indigenous shelters. The quilt still hung on his wall. Family names faded slightly but still legible, a reminder of that crisis winter when 11 people had crowded into this space seeking warmth that their own construction couldn't provide. Some of those families had moved on to other territories carrying the double-wall knowledge with them. Others remained neighbors, their own retrofitted cabins, standing as permanent testament to lessons learned through near-fatal experience. Outside wind tested the walls with familiar force. February cold 15 below, sustained wind above 25 miles per hour. Conditions that would defeat single-wall construction, that would create thermal crisis requiring desperate fuel consumption and constant fire feeding. But inside Lars's cabin, the temperature held steady at 53 degrees, with a single evening fire banked hours earlier. Dead air doing its invisible work, trapping heat. That moving air would steal, proving once again that understanding physics mattered more than fighting nature. And in that moment, standing in warmth earned through principle rather than brute force, Lars understood the true measure of success. Not the money from consulting, not the recognition from communities across territories, not even the lives saved during crisis winters. The real success was that knowledge freely shared had multiplied beyond his capacity to track, that principles proven through one cabin had improved existence for thousands of families, that understanding had replaced trial and error as the foundation for construction that could withstand whatever winter chose to deliver. The walls held their heat, the wind exhausted itself against barriers designed to let it pass without stealing warmth. And somewhere across the territories in cabins, in schoolhouses, and churches built by people, Lars would never meet. Dead air was doing the same invisible work, keeping families safe not through luck or prayer, but through physics, that didn't care about national origin or community opinion, only about whether air could move or had to stay still.